So I've been working in prisons, teaching and running arts programs since 2001. And I have to say, you know, in the last couple of years, the last 2 or 3 years or so, you know, after spending many, many years literally fighting to get inside of a prison, like who fights to get inside of a prison, you know, artists and educators and people who want to engage folks who are inside, and yet for a long time it was very, very hard. And so it's been really interesting just in the last couple of years to see that we've all in this country begun to reach a place where we realize, whether you are a correctional officer or you run a prison or you're you know, in the nonprofit sector, across the board, people are recognizing that the state of our criminal justice system is really, really, really in a dire place, and we have to do something about it, right? Like, we're going to collapse under the weight of it. And so now it's become a little bit easier to like get inside of a prison than it has been in the past, and more important than ever that we are inside of these spaces for this very reason. So the you know, after many years of eliminating, you know, after eliminating Pell Grants, access to Pell Grants for incarcerated students in 1994, the U.S. federal government is now reinstating Pell Grants, or at least a pilot program of Pell Grants for incarcerated students. And the first round of applications, there were 217 applications, right? So that says that like universities around the country are really interested in going back into prisons and to expanding the access to education, because, you know, it's very clear that the data is very clear that more than anything, education is the thing that reduces recidivism. The more access to education that someone has, the less likely they are to return to prison, to the point in which the likelihood is zero. And so that's why it's really important for us to be there. So this summer, after, you know, being on the steering committee the last 2 years and being a part of this process to develop this program, and being really kind of inspired by my colleagues and who have all come to the table and found a way to make this happen, despite dealing with one of, you know, the Department of Corrections, which can be like one of the most difficult and most bureaucratic spaces to try to work in, and contradictory on so many levels, launched this program in January. And I got a chance to teach in the program this summer. And I thought a lot about what kind of course I would teach. Like, I teach at Gallatin, which is a school of interdisciplinary studies, and my students are, you know, they concentrate in a lot of things, right? Like lots of interdisciplinary things. And I like to think and teach in interdisciplinary ways, which is why I teach there. But I thought about, like, so what kind of course do I want to offer that would, one, offer my students the kind of foundational skills that they will need if they want to transfer into, you know, another institution, but also give them a real taste of what Gallatin is like, or what NYU is like, or at least in my classroom, right? So I thought about public speaking, right? I said, you know, I have a background in theater, a background in the arts, and so I thought about public speaking as a course, but really I was thinking about leadership development. You know, it's like public speaking, yeah, that sounds good on paper, that'll transfer anywhere, but really what I want to do is teach a leadership development course, because I have the chance to work with some incredible formerly incarcerated leaders who are doing really powerful work to build movement in New York City and beyond, and they inspire me every day. And so I was like, we need more of those kinds of leaders. And so I thought about going into Wallkill and creating a space in which we could talk about leadership, right? Talk about using the power of our voices towards the creation of the kind of world that we want to live in. And so so that was the course, and what I thought I was being kind of I thought that, what I was doing was something that I would kind of have to sell them on. But in reality, what I discovered as soon as I got in the classroom with my students is that they were already there, that they were already deeply committed to making their education mean something in the world. And so, I'll tell one particular story of a student in my class who, one of the first assignments that I gave them was to write a personal story, give a personal story speech. And he wrote about, seeing his father, who was also incarcerated, and seeing him in transport. And they hadn't seen each other in over 20 years. And they were seeing each other for the first time. And transport, both in chains. And everyone in the room was really emotional in hearing him tell this story. And what the breakthrough was for him was the realization that he wanted to be able to speak for children who have incarcerated parents. And so we went through the semester, and so we started with a personal story speech, and then one of the very last assignment that we had was that students had to write informative speeches, and if they wanted to, they could make it a persuasive, speech with a call to action. And his final speech was about the importance of creating the importance of finding ways to meet the needs of children whose parents were incarcerated. And again, really powerful. He gave us a sense of the scale of the issue, why it mattered, and he used his story to frame this for us. And in terms of when we think about leadership, what greater testament to the power of a leader than to be able to use your personal story in a way that persuades an audience to take action. And so those are the kinds of students that we encounter at Wallkill, and I think that we would all really be given a real gift. If those students came home and joined us here on campus. Because as we think about diversity, we're thinking about, I think at this point in 2015, we think about diversity as more than just, a diversity of race and gender and identity and the way that we traditionally think about identity, but also a diversity of experience. I say to my students all the time, is like, if you're sitting in class next to someone who was just like the same people that you went to high school with, then that's really unfortunate, right? Like, what kind of education are you getting if you don't get to engage with people who have totally different life experiences from you and can share like completely different perspectives based on that experience? That's the kind of education that all of our students deserve. And so with this program, we get to bring to the table students who are, incredibly diverse and bring so many gifts as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Piper. Piper and I commuted during the summer to teach our courses, so it's great to be reunited. Can everyone hear at the back? Because sometimes the acoustics in this room aren't so great. Just put up your hand if you can't. I just wanted to begin by saying something that some of you may not be aware of, but prison education used to be a very normal part of higher education landscape. In the heyday, in the 1980s, there were several hundred college degree programs across the country, and very much at the core of the prison reform movement that really emerged in the wake of the Attica uprising in 1971. And at that time, it was really state provision of prison education that was seen as anchoring that doctrine. And ironically, in New York State, the expansion of the SUNY College network, which was concomitant with state provision, that doctrine of state provision of prison education, happened under the governorship of Nelson Rockefeller. And as many of you know, he was also the governor that put his name on these very harsh drug sentencing laws that fueled the prison building boom from the 1980s onwards. And it's in those decades of the prison building boom which provided a lot of jobs, a lot of income to depressed rural communities in upstate New York. It's during those decades that we also saw the state withdrawing from its commitments to public education in general, to public higher education in general, and to prison education in particular. During these decades, we saw the right to education being supplanted by the right to access education loans. And in the case of incarcerated students who were getting federal grants from the federal government, as you heard, it was in 1994 that Bill Clinton cut these off in a particularly cynical gesture to show he was tough on crime. And in the wake of that, legislation, the programs just collapsed very rapidly all across the country. And it's in the last 15 years or so that we've seen private, small liberal arts private colleges mostly step in to fill the gap, and in a scattershot way. And NYU's entry, it comes at a very propitious moment, because as Piper noted, there's a shift in the political winds on this issue. A lot of bipartisan interest in reducing prison populations and even in reintroducing Pell Grants. So what can I say about our program? First of all, there's many good reasons in the last 15 years for not feeling so great about NYU, to put it frankly. And this prison education program is not one of them. In fact, quite the opposite. Everyone that hears about it seems to, their eyes light up. They get it. It's something that they feel we can really be proud of at NYU, which is not nothing. And it's certainly, speaking for myself, it's sort of high point in my NYU career, because I was partly drawn here by this, this motto that Gwyneth and Nikhil invoked, the private university and the public service. And I agree that our program is very much an embodiment of that. Why is it important to talk about public service? Well, there are many critics of the carceral system that aren't too crazy about prison education. They're mostly focused on decarceration, decriminalization, and the abolition of prisons. And from that perspective, putting a lot of energy into offering a degree in a prison can seem like not necessarily the best thing. It can be seen as a way of legitimizing or perpetuating a fundamentally unjust system, that we might be inflating the prison bubble at the very moment when people are beginning to pop it. And instead of putting money into prison education, we should be diverting all of the money that flows into prisons, $60 billion or whatever it is now, towards quality public education on the outside and a range of other social services. So I think all these arguments and critiques are, perfectly valid. I don't think they're the whole story, however. Mm-hmm. And let me just name a few ways of pushing back in that. First of all, professionals have a social obligation to respond to the needs of vulnerable populations that are in distress, whatever profession we're talking about. And they're usually, when they do that, they're not held culpable for or complicit in the reasons for that distress. I think about Doctors Without Borders. Mm-hmm. We don't find them culpable for the reasons for the damages of their clients, as it were. And that's important to note. Secondly, as Nikhil mentioned, education is not the only thing that we plan to do in this program. We want to have a research component. Programs already involved in re-entry support. There might be some opportunity to intervene in the school-to-prison pipeline at some point. These are all possible components of this program as it expands. And you can do all of these things and still advocate for the abolition of prisons at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, right? And one thing leads to another often when people get into an area of advocacy and they're involved in that. One thing leads to another. The third reason, I think, is that NYU's entry, I think, is important because we're not a small liberal arts college. Right. We are a heavyweight research one institution. It means something for NYU to get into this sector. It certainly means something at Wallkill, and I think for the Department of Corrections that NYU is committed to that. So again, it's not just about us feeling good about NYU. It's about the outside world, the world of the carceral system responding in that regard. And then last but not least, to my mind at least, prison education is not primarily about responding to the needs of a population. It's about responding to their rights. And it's about upholding their rights. And in this instance, it's about upholding the right to education. And that's very important because we're dealing with a population, incarcerated people have been stripped of all sorts of rights on the inside. And then when they come out, they're disenfranchised in all sorts of ways, and they don't enjoy full citizenly rights and so on and so forth. So the least we can do is try to reintroduce rights and support these rights within the prison, and in general, upholding the right to education seems just very, very important right now in the public sphere at a time when we have this sort of crushing education debt that is weighing down upon so many members of student bodies and making it more and more difficult to access the right to education. So I want to say just mention a few words about the origins. Some of the speakers have talked a little bit about the origins of the program, but there was one person who was missing, and that was an undergraduate by the name of Jacob Alderdice, who was a student in SCA. And for his senior thesis, he wrote a prize-winning thesis about the prison education programs that Bard College and Wesleyan and Marymount and others were offering. And we thought it was a very interesting study. And Mary Pratt, who was chair of SCA at the time, asked Jacob to do a feasibility study of the possible locations that we might put a program in. What are the prisons in downstate New York or New Jersey even? We looked at some in New Jersey, which were within a commuting orbit. And that sparked further interest on the part of faculty. And so faculty drove the conversation, and then Deans Wofford and Starr responded very warmly, and then the resource-rich foundations responded with resources. In other words, it was a bottom-up initiative. And I think it's important to note that. It's important to have that in an educational institution, because we have faculty and students who drive an initiative, then they are committed to it, they feel some ownership over it, it gets done better. And by the contrary is that when you have initiatives that are driven from the top down by administration, they have to look for buy-in from faculty, and there's less commitment, and it just doesn't work so well. You have to offer lavish stipends to go and staff overseas branches of NYU. And that's very expensive, and it's a kind of artificial buy-in. Everyone gets paid to teach in the prison education program, it should be said, but no one's going to retire on the proceeds. It's not the money that's driving it, quite frankly. I taught in the summer, and I taught an American Studies survey, and let me just say a few words to finish about that and about the students. Everyone who's ever taught in a prison has told me that it's a very richly rewarding pedagogical experience, and so I found it to be so. And that's good. But that's less important than whether the students are feeling that it's a rewarding pedagogical experience. I mean, what are the benefits from them? That's more difficult to say. And it may be a little too early to say that, although the evidence we've collected so far suggests that things are going well. The students are beginning to feel some ownership over the program on the inside, which is very important. And I think increasingly the authorities are beginning to feel a little more comfortable about having us there and proud, in a way, of hosting us. It's not all great, however. It can be very frustrating. My experience teaching in the prison. It's very difficult to meet your students outside of the allotted time. because they're so overscheduled. It's also, and you really need to, I felt really needed to meet them on the outside of that allotted time. There's also that very difficult moment where you leave the prison. And for me, I always felt I was leaving my responsibilities behind because I was free to go. And free to go home, free to go to my family, free to resume my life as a citizen. And my students were decidedly unfree and confined in a location that was almost the opposite of what a college campus could be or should be, which is what our normative experience is. So that was always a very difficult moment for me. And Wallkill architecture is a little deceiving in this regard, because when you approach the prison for the first time, it looks like an idyllic liberal arts college in a rural location with this breathtaking view of the Shwangung Mountains, and that's the way it's designed. But then your gaze shifts to the maximum security prison across the road, Shwangung Max Security Prison. And that is prison architecture at its most grim and menacing. It looks like a really serious claustrophobic site of punishment. It's a quite different form of architecture. So my students, unlike my students here at NYU, my students in Wallkill read every single page of all the assignments, all the readings that I assigned. If there was a page missing, they let me know all about it. They really wanted that page, and that's a big difference, I think, from my students here. They don't always read the assignments. They had a little more. They lacked the polish of NYU students, so they had a little more trouble with writing assignments. But there was a lot more passion involved, I think, in the writing assignments. Nor did they hesitate to draw me into the life of the prison, which was interesting for me, because we had a discussion beforehand about this topic, which is, we thought was an important topic at the time, which was whether you teach to the context inside the prison, or do you go in and you shut out the prison? Once you shut the classroom door, do you shut the prison out? And BARD philosophy, for example, in the BARD program, the BARD philosophy is to shut the prison out. That the last thing that incarcerated students want is proselytizing. The last thing they want to do is study the prison industrial complex and so on and so forth. They live it. Why would they want to study it? We didn't have any conclusive outcome in our discussions, so we don't have a party line or a house doctrine about how to do this. But and I didn't set any readings about prisons in my course. However, I found that students were bringing up the prison experience and using it as a filter for discussion in sort of unprompted and organic ways, which proved, very interesting to me, at least. Topics like, work and labor, which is one of the central topics of my course. All my students work very hard in the prison, doing reproductive functions. In addition, there's a prison labor program making glasses or spectacles. They're paid 25 cents an hour or so. So they all work very hard, and they have this experience of working. And so that filtered into our debates about work and labor. Gender and sexuality, they're in an enforced all-male environment, and that filtered the way in which they talk about gender and sexuality, but they did. Race relations, of course, and racialization is pretty omnipresent within the prison, not just internally among prisoners, but also because all of the guards are white. And most of the prisoners are prisoners of color, and so there was a very rich discourse that circulated around that. In terms of urban studies, which is another part of my course, central part of my course, they all had some experience of inner city street life for the most part, but there was a continuum between that street life and the rural economy that they were now living in, and rural economies that they had been living in, some of them for 15, 20 years. And they had a lot of insights into rural economy and the way in which the prison was feeding into the rural economy. And as one of my students said, this is hillbilly welfare here. This is the political economy of the prison. And they had a pretty advanced analysis of how that works, much, much deeper than I did, that's for sure. And lastly, some of them were from immigrant families, so they had the topic of immigration, I found, among the students was as animated as it is on the outside in the public sphere here. And last, I think, but not least, they really didn't, having been in this institution for so long, they really didn't need much prompting to understand and talk about the historical continuity between the plantation and the prison. That historical continuity, which a lot of scholars have written about and taught about, but we weren't doing any of those readings, and they were able to make those connections on their own, both peculiar institutions in the sense in which they have been talked about as peculiar American institutions, but with a spectrum of continuity between them. So that's tantamount to saying that I didn't need to set the prison readings, but the students used the prison to do the readings in a way in the course and use them as a filter, and in a way that made them really sort of ideal students of a course about American history and American studies generally. So it really was a terrific experience.